Good morning to my good friend, Dr. Constance Scharff.
Hey, how are you?
Great to have you here on my Zoom interviews during COVID-19. Constance is a addiction and mental health expert, and she's joined me and going to answer those three questions. So the first question is, of all the books you've read, and you've read profusely in many languages, which is a book that has influenced you the most?
I would say my favorite book is The Little Prince. My favorite book is The Little Prince, and I love its look at friendship. What does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to love? What are the sacrifices that we make for connection? I just find it a profound book, and I just love it. And I love the beginning. I've drawn you a picture of a sheep. And you can always find like-minded people when you draw that little picture, and it's like, oh, the Little Prince. I'm like, you're my people. You're my people.
Wonderful. Can you remember when you read that book first?
I was probably a teenager. And it's funny because you think of it as a children's book. I mean, I think of it as a children's book, and it certainly is not. I mean, it's accessible to children on the level of, it's an interesting story. But the love he has for the rose and the care that he takes of the rose and how desperately he wants to get back to the rose and his fear that she, is too fragile to be alone. All of those things really speak to me, and the people that he meets on his journey. I also love the part about the fox and what it means to tame someone and become, a friend and be in connection. And so it was very profound to me. And it's interesting because it's a little bit different when you read it. Of course, I read it in English mostly, but it's a little bit different when you read it in French. And it's a little bit different, or it's a lot different when I struggle through it in Hebrew. And so, but the idea of love, and then that he, the snake at the end that sends him back home. I mean, it's that romantic but crushing story. And so, yeah, I first read it as a teenager, and I probably have 4 or 5 copies of it around the house. And I've got it, like I said, I have it in French, I have it in English, I have it in Hebrew, I have it in hardcover, I have it in soft cover. I mean, it's a pretty important book. It's a pretty important book to me.
Great, thank you. That's a beautiful answer. And now to second question. Of all the films you've seen throughout the years, which is the one that has left the greatest impact upon you?
The Breakfast Club. Do you remember that?
Of course.
With Molly Ringwald and Judd Nelson and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, it came out when I can't remember when it came out. I want to say late 80s. So it was right before I went to high. It's probably in junior high. So they're just a little bit older than me. And to see how we're already tracked at such an early age, that our destinies are written, and that it isn't hard and fast, but it's really hard to get out of that. The jock, the princess, the criminal, the basket case, and the brain. And of course, in my life, I'm like, oh, I'm the brain. Like I look at the film, I'm like, I'm the brain. And still in my life, right at the end, he writes, the character Brian writes the paper for everybody. I'm still that person in my life, and the company that I work for, the charity I work for, Rock to Recovery, I work with all musicians, and then I'm the doctor. And so if there's anything that needs to be written, they're like, Doc, could you handle that? I'm like, send it over. I mean, sure, I'm an award-winning writer, and if I wanted someone to play something on guitar, I'd ask one of them. I mean, we are playing to our strengths, but it is typical and stereotypical. that we play to these roles, and really the role of the criminal, right? That the teacher was just so, Judd Nelson's role, this teacher so hard after him. And it could be so different if he'd had a little bit of social support, if he'd had a little bit of mental health counseling, if he'd had these things, he could have had a different opportunity. And I see that in the United States today, right? I see that play out where if you, like Black Lives Matter movement, right? If you have there are systems in place that keep us on particular paths. It never occurred to me not to go to college. It's not a surprise that I'm a PhD, that I'm a doctor. It never occurred to me not to go to college. There are other people that it never occurred to them to go to college because of the way our life paths are. So I love The Breakfast Club, and I love the line where one of them says, "Are we going to end up like our parents?" And the response is, "It's inevitable." And I don't want that to be true. I mean, that's the work that I do, is to make that not true. But I remember that really made an impression on me. I was like, that's not cool. I want something different.
Lovely. I love the way you moved from the personal choice of a film to the political, and really showing there are no gaps between the two realms, which leads me to my third question. Which political event has shaped you? And by political, I mean, of course, not party political, but anything that has happened in the public sphere.
I want to say there are really two things, and they happened really at a similar point in time. And that was when Nelson Mandela was freed and when the Berlin Wall came down. And both of those events, in some ways quite different, but in some ways very similar, showed me, because I was in high school at the time, showed me that change is possible. And despite what we are told, power ultimately is in the hands of people. Because when the Berlin Wall came down in particular, I remember seeing all the people hitting it with hammers, and it was the people breaking it down. It wasn't that there was some treaty and some big pirate, where they blow up a building to take it down, the big buildings and whatnot. It was a spontaneous action of, we've had enough. We've had enough. And to me, that really signified the end of the Cold War as we knew it then. And I think people feel like they're so powerless sometimes. And it's because we buy into the idea that we are powerless. But I mean, when we think back at, the French history, right? And let them eat cake, and then the next thing you know, you're in the guillotine, right? The French Revolution, people have the power to make change. I prefer when it's with a vote. I don't really want people running around and blowing up houses and burning things down and whatever. But sometimes that's what it takes. I mean, the American Revolution, it was a revolution. The Civil War was a civil war. I mean, these things in our history happened. So yeah, the idea that we are not victims and we are not powerless, and that if we want something to change, there are avenues to do that. And when we speak power to authority, there can be change. That made a real big impression on me. And it was the same thing with Nelson Mandela. I never thought, it never occurred to me that Nelson Mandela would actually be let free. I was a kid, but I was like, everybody's like, free Mandela, free Mandela, free Mandela. And I was like, yeah, he's gonna die in prison. And then that didn't happen. Of course, we met in South Africa, and there's some beautiful monuments to him, and getting to the opportunity to go to the prison where he's held. And we get to see the evolution of that, and his calls for no retribution. That we don't just, because that happened in other countries, right? When the Native Africans came, to power, the colonizers in some other places were slaughtered. And he was like, that's not how we're going to roll in South Africa. And that compassion, and of course, Gandhi, having spent so much time in South Africa as well, that compassion that was there also made. So we can speak, to power, and we can change things. And also we can have, a compassionate connection with people who are or have been our oppressors. And I see that both in Germany and in South Africa.
Beautiful. Yeah, those was really shattering events. And I like the way you started off by saying that things were inevitable when you talked about that film. And now I can see how that expands, and saying, despite that, we do have the power to act. We don't have to be passive, even though things seem to be inevitable.
Right. Well, that's about our story, right? We've been taught a story. My story is I'm the brain, right? And I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to write the papers, and I'm going to be in charge, and things are going to roll a certain way. But for the people who don't have that cushy life, right? Although this isn't cushy either. I mean, there's problems that come along with this as well. But for people who don't have that opportunity, I have, and this is what I saw with Nelson Mandela, and this is what I saw in Germany, is with the Berlin Wall coming down, is I have a responsibility, right? That's what those events, I mean, that's the juxtaposition of the film with the political event. Right. And it goes back to the book, right? I want to have connection. I want to have connection. I want to have friendship. I want to have love. I want to have meaningful relationships. I don't want to be like in the book, the businessman who just, how much money do I have? Well, that's not very fun. Or the king who has no one to rule over. Oh, will you be my subject? No, no. And we have all those characters, right? And so I like the idea that we get to push and change our narrative. And once we change that story that we tell ourselves, Nelson Mandela is telling us, change your story. Change your story. You're not here to be colonized. You're not here to be oppressed. You're here to lead. This is our nation. And we're going to do it in a compassionate way that includes people who have been, oppressive to us. And so we can have that change of story. And that's, sort of where the three pieces fit together for me.
Beautiful. Thank you. To conclude, is there something you'd like to say as a farewell statement about what's going on right now?
Yeah, it's tough here right now. It's tough in the States. And my hope is that we will choose to stand together and say, okay, this is enough. Our systems have been corrupted. They are not working properly. And that's going to make it hard. And it's not okay. What's happening now with the strife that we're seeing, coronavirus aside, which is a whole different global problem, we can do better. And I hope that in the coming weeks, we choose that.
Wonderful message to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope we meet soon.